We conclude the beautiful little book of Ruth. It has the ending you've been wanting. The romance is concluded, but then it has a twist, a surprise ending that you may not have expected. Ruth, a woman of Moab, has, quote, returned to Bethlehem of Judah, a place she's never been before, placing her life in the hands of the God of Israel, and trusting in the guidance of her mother-in-law, and relying on the support of a man of high standing in the small community. As our romance draws to a successful conclusion, with the marriage of Ruth and Boaz, there is a much greater message we're to get from this story. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. When he made love to her, the Lord enabled her to conceive, and she gave birth to a son. Notice how quickly the storyteller moves us now. The Hebrew phrase went to her was a euphemism for sex. It usually meant he went into her room. The similar American phrase would be he slept with her. You are to understand that they didn't just sleep. One edition of the NIV translates the phrase as went to her, while another edition translates it as made love to her. So some questions. And the storyteller is asking these. They're embedded here, and you're to think them through. Who is ultimately responsible for the fertility of Ruth and Boaz? Why did Ruth not conceive before? She'd been married for some time. Why was Boaz unmarried? Why did Ruth at the beginning, as it turned out, go to Boaz's field? Ruth in chapters 2 and 3 is aggressive, but after being aggressive that night on the threshing floor, she and Boaz wait patiently, spending the night waiting for the dawn. Surely there was the temptation that night on the threshing floor to hurry God's timing. Ruth was almost redeemed. Boaz was almost her husband, but the couple remained chaste, and Ruth goes home to wait while Boaz prepares his negotiations. And they're rewarded the next night, as Boaz takes her into his home and goes to her. And apparently 9 months later, they have a child. There is a lot of wisdom required in knowing when God wants us to be aggressive and when he wants us to be passive. The women said to Naomi, "Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel. He will renew your life and sustain you in your old age. For your daughter-in-law, who loves you and who is better to you than 7 sons, has given him birth." Then Naomi took the child in her arms and cared for him. The women living there said, "Naomi has a son," and they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. I think this is my favorite passage of the book. Visualize this. Ruth has labored throughout the day, the midwives work with her, and finally, amid her cries, there's the cry of a child, a son. The child is cleaned by the midwives and caressed by the exhausted Ruth. Maybe he nurses a little, and then he is triumphantly carried by the women of the community to Naomi, who waits for word of Ruth's labor. According to the text of this passage, who has a son is not Ruth. What do the women say? How do their statements to Naomi compare with their first conversation with Naomi? And how did Naomi respond? Can't you see Naomi sobbing softly, holding the child as the women leave to take the good news to the street? Why do the women say this child will renew Naomi? How do the women describe Ruth's value, her daughter-in-law's value, to Naomi? In verse 11, we have a blessing by the townspeople. May you have standing in Ephrathah and be famous in Bethlehem. But what is the prophecy of the women? The prophecy of the women is stronger still. Who named Obed? Obed apparently means one who works or serves, and may be short for Obadiah, which means one who serves Yahweh. What is the implied theological or spiritual statement of this passage? The phrase translated cared for him in verse 16 implies some type of long-term arrangement, as maybe a nanny or guardian or foster mother. And while we're at it, compare chapter 4, verse 15 with 1 Samuel 1:8, where Elkanah says to his wife Hannah, "Hannah, why are you weeping? Why don't you eat? Why are you downhearted? Don't I mean more to you than 10 sons?" Having lots of sons was a very important thing to women in that culture. We'll continue. Here's the conclusion. This then is the family line of Perez. Perez was the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon the father of Boaz, Boaz the father of Obed, Obed the father of Jesse, and Jesse the father of David. Hezron is mentioned in Genesis 46 as traveling with Jacob's descendants to Egypt at the time of Joseph. Nahshon is mentioned in Leviticus 1 and 2 as the leader of the tribe of Judah when the Israelites leave Egypt with Moses 400 years later. So we're clearly being given only part of the lineage of Boaz. And according to ancient tradition, says a commentary, the position of seventh descendant in a genealogy was a special one. So this genealogy was apparently structured to give prominence to Obed. Why? How does the book close? Why is David mentioned? And what's the main point of the book? In 1:9, Naomi says, "May the Lord grant that each of you will find rest in the home of another husband," who, at the beginning of chapter 3, is used to answer Naomi's prayer. And in 2:12, Boaz says, "May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge," who, in chapter 4, answers Boaz's prayer. Centuries later, in a genealogical line of Tamar, Rahab, Ruth, Boaz, Obed, Jesse, David, we'll see another woman in Jerusalem. She also will have a son. That child will also be announced by kings, shepherds, and angels as the Redeemer. But that Bethlehem story is for another time.